And for the next 7 days, I'm going to be using 0 dopamine.
We covered dopamine and what it is. We talked about the circuitry and the different kinds of circuitry. We talked about the relationship between peaks and troughs and baselines, and the foundational tools that allow us to set and maintain a healthy baseline level of dopamine, as well as ways to protect that baseline level of dopamine, how to get ourselves out of states of procrastination.
Ending my last day of a dopamine detox. I'm very much so not going back to my previous habits of social media. We've completed the challenge. 7 days, no dopamine. No, I'm just kidding. There was a lot of dopamine. Actually, ironically, during a dopamine detox, I experienced more dopamine than ever. And not only dopamine, obviously more enjoyment in the present, and experienced more endorphins and oxytocin and even serotonin. Again, these are just lists of more so like the gratification molecules, right? Like the feelings of appreciating the things in the now. When I went on my walks and my bike rides and looking around and the smells and the trees, and I just started appreciating things I didn't appreciate, but also I felt more dopamine in the things that used to not do it for me anymore. A dopamine detox is you're not cutting happiness out of your life, you're cutting the poor dopamine-driven habits that essentially tax your dopaminergic system, right? So over the course of here being at the house, I have to get tires installed in my car, and then I'm heading straight to California, and I'll be in California. Over the course of all that, I'm gonna be explaining in the least boring way I can what I learned about dopamine and how it works. And again, I am not a scientist, I'm not a researcher, I just read a book and listened to some podcasts, all while building some anecdotal evidence for myself while doing the detox. If any of this is wrong, it was at least just my interpretation. So this should help you guys understand. The more you can understand dopamine, the more you can use it in your day-to-day. Dopamine is not good nor bad, but it can also be good and bad. It is not one or the other. It has its pros, it has its cons. It's a huge attributor to addiction, but it's also a huge attributor to drive, progress, and success. Like I mentioned before, there's dopamine and there's what they call here and now molecules. It's what the book was referring to. It's the molecules in your brain that generate your different emotions: happiness, contentment, fulfillment, joy, sadness, being tired. All these things are the here and now molecules. So essentially it's what you're feeling now. It's what's in front of you. It's what's at reach. Dopamine is what isn't at reach. It's ahead of you. It's the future. It typically hasn't happened yet. The most dumbed down form of how dopamine works is like, if I want a sandwich, right? I'm just sitting there and I'm like, oh my God, a sandwich sounds good right now. I get a spike in dopamine, the excitement, the anticipation for this sandwich that I am now going to figure out how to obtain. And then the dopamine drops immediately. And so during its drop back to baseline, sometimes even below baseline, is where my brain and body, typically, if I decide that I am actually going to have a sandwich, if the drive is enough, is going to do what it can to get a sandwich. So I'm going to think about, where do I get a sandwich? What sandwich do I want? How can I obtain this sandwich? And so I could either make one at home or I go to Jersey Mike's, whatever it is. If I decide to go to Jersey Mike's, I'm assuming that Jersey Mike's is open, and I'm assuming that if I get a sandwich at Jersey Mike's, it's going to be as good as I thought it was going to be in that initial spike. And so this is just the process of how one dopamine transaction works. Spike in dopamine, I want a sandwich. Drop in dopamine is then what causes me to then want to fulfill that spike in dopamine. And so I'm gonna do whatever I can to get the sandwich. And then once I obtain said sandwich, the amount I then enjoy the sandwich is gonna dictate not only the final spike in dopamine, but then the transfer over into those here and now molecules, how much I actually enjoy the sandwich. And one of the big things I learned is called reward prediction error. And so essentially my prediction on how good the reward is going to be, using the words in the terminology. When I have that initial spike in dopamine, I have this idea of how good this sandwich is going to be. And whether or not the sandwich meets that assumption, prediction or not, dictates what my dopamine is going to do at the end of the circuit. If the sandwich is in fact as good as I thought, if not better, then you will have another spike in dopamine. Your dopamine's not fulfilled. After you eat your sandwich, you're on to the next thing. You don't get that same spike that you got thinking about wanting the sandwich. You just got a little spike in dopamine. You experience the here and now molecules. You experience serotonin, endorphins, whatever it is, the enjoyment of that sandwich. Or if the sandwich turns out it's not as good as you assumed, you actually will then have a dip below baseline in dopamine because there was actually an error in your reward prediction. So is the outcome of what you initially wanted better or worse than what you originally predicted? And so you take your assumption and you minus the result, whatever that may be, leaves you with essentially your experience. And so I get that was really nerdy and that took a lot of time, but that is the basis of how dopamine gets you to get things done. So if you want to make $1 million in your head, you're like, if I get $1 million, I will be happy. You get this spike in dopamine. And typically over the longer course of time, I assume that there are multiple spikes in dopamine in the process, because as you take steps closer to obtaining your goal, you are experiencing dopamine in the pursuit. Once you achieve your goal, ironically, you will not experience much dopamine because you will immediately have a dopamine spike related to the next goal, and that will then wait to be fulfilled. You will experience some of the H&N, the here and now molecule experiences, endorphins and such, but it will not typically be what you assume because of reward prediction error. So the sandwich is a small example, but understanding this is helpful to understanding how you can positively use dopamine, setting goals and having a vision for your future, understanding that dopamine is found in the process and not in the acquisition of something, and that transfers over into your gratitude and appreciation, which you also need to have along the lines, because as soon as you have that initial jump in dopamine, it then falls. And so you're creating desire, and desire, something I heard great mentioned by Alex Hormozy, who was referencing someone else, is essentially, like we said, a contract with yourself that you will not be happy until you obtain what you get. And so after that initial spike in dopamine happens, you're typically not happy until you achieve something, unless you are gracious and present in the process or in the pursuit, whereas you can also access dopamine again, and then you can access those here and now molecules. I like to call them like the appreciation molecules, the enjoyment molecules in what's actually happening in your day-to-day, because the future doesn't exist. All that exists is right now. A second from now is merely just an idea. This is getting so nerdy, we're gonna go to the next part.
This is what healthy road trips look like.
If you don't know what alien jerky is, I think it's a stop. Is it on the way back from Vegas, I think? They had it at some random gas station. I was like, okay, $12.99 for like a couple pieces of jerky? Perfect. I also wanted to continue our explanation in the car, but I left the little tiny mount to put you guys on the window. And if I put you guys there when we're moving, it's not gonna look great. So, to California. Another massive thing that it talks about in the book is what they call dopaminergic people. So people that are more wired to operate based upon dopamine than the here and now molecules have different tendencies than the other. And science proves that. Whether it's political, you can connect dopamine-driven people to a certain type of politics, and vice versa. You can connect dopamine-driven people being more prone to addiction, or being more prone to success, or being more prone to being creative, and vice versa. Too many for me to repeat. You will have a good understanding based upon who you are, of whether you are traditionally at your core a more dopamine driven person or a more present here and now emotion driven person. Knowing what you are is very important so that you can then use it as a tool, or understanding whether you are too much of one or the other can then help you figure out a way to consciously get yourself back to a better balance. Which leads me to the last thing, and I think the most important thing that I read, which also closed out the book, so I think it was more important in nature, was summarizing the entire concept of these two types of molecules that exist on a seesaw. When one is high, the other is low. They do not exist independently of each other, rather so they exist dependently of each other. Dopamine suppresses the here and now molecules, and here and now molecules suppress dopamine. When you have a spike in dopamine, you are most likely not experiencing much of the other molecules, and vice versa. The question being pegged at the end of this book that I read is like, okay, well, what's the ideal setup? What do you strive towards? If there's ways you can control not only like what we did in this detox, my baseline dopamine, but how dopamine drives me, and how I can use dopamine as a tool, and how I can use the here and now molecules to better stay present and appreciate today, which is really all we have, then what's ideal, right? What do I strive towards? I'm a very practical person. Like everything else in life, it's balance. And now I'm gonna tell you something really, really cool predicated on this idea, but finding the balance between using dopamine to fuel progress, chasing after your goals while not having too many desires, right? Dopamine is essentially desire. It's something I also heard in a podcast recently that was really interesting, is like, because of what we talked about with desire, it's like, don't have a bunch of desires. Just pick one or two overarching desires that you think will benefit your life and go after those, and all the other desires, just drop them. There's no need to be unhappy because you don't have all these things, when unhappiness is a symptom of it. Yeah, we all want success, and maybe we are trading some current happiness now for the future, but that's not always a negative. And so figuring out like, what are the things you really want in life? Use the desire for those to trigger a dopaminergic reaction so that you can put forth the effort and the work and the planning necessary to achieve that, and then everything else, have gratitude for what you have rather than just what you don't. Now, this is the coolest thing I saw. The closest thing you can do to satisfying dopamine, right? The molecule of more, the molecule that's never satisfied, is by mastery. It's mastering a skill. It is the epitome of balance between dopamine and these satisfactory molecules, because you get to a point where you almost have done it. Dopamine is nearly satisfied. I say nearly because it in theory really isn't. You've nearly satisfied it because you fell in love with the process of something, and you've also backed it up with countless hours of work and knowledge and intelligence to get yourself to a point where you can almost say, I've done it. When do you actually know you've mastered something? I don't know, but you will get to a point where you're so confident in what you've done. You're so confident where you're at, but you've also completed a goal predicated on something that is fueled by drive and desire. All these principles you learn in the book sort of meet at this balance of mastery. And so finding something you're extremely passionate about that lights that fire inside of you, that desire to get better, conquering that, and the progress then releases dopamine, and then you reach a point in where you're very satisfied with what you've done, but you haven't entirely gotten rid of that dopamine yet, so they can kind of both coexist. The way I understood it is like that, and it makes sense in my head. I don't know if I'm doing a good job of articulating it. Articulating these new concepts is a little difficult for me, especially with all the big terminology, and like I said, there's a bunch of other here and now molecules that I can't name, like vasopressin or something like that, and like there's so many of them, whereas dopamine is just one molecule. But you can get a depth on the receptors and different medication that can block receptors or push more dopamine in your system, and all these different things I could talk about and bore you, but you can read the book or listen to Dr. Angie Huberman has a bunch of great podcasts on dopamine, one or two of which I've still yet to consume. I hope this at least shined light on the interest and the awareness of how much dopamine plays into our lives, and how much of this culture we're living in is preying on our dopamine, from marketing to social platforms. I mean, everyone is competing for attention, and dopamine is a very acute way of accessing that in people. Being aware of it to both put up a safety net for yourself on defense, and then on offense, using it as a tool to better your life, and figuring out how to balance the desire for something with actual gratitude for those joyful feelings, the endorphins and the oxytocin and the more satisfactory chemicals in your brain that actually make you feel content and they make you feel good and happy, whereas dopamine is a very roller coaster based emotional circuit that is, again, never satisfied. And so if you never want to be satisfied in life, always go down the dopamine route with no safety precautions or no awareness put in play. And if you want to be satisfied, then understand how you can use dopamine to further your life and use it for progression, but figure out how to balance it to where those here and now molecules, I understand this phrasing is weird, it's what the book used, can be more present in your life and make you more present and make you more gracious and happy and joyful in the things that you're doing. I had a very good week. Today was my first day back on social media, and I really haven't scrolled through it yet. I ended up just working on it a lot of the morning and posting an update. Let me know what kind of videos, or at least what topics within the personal development space or the psychology space or the philosophy space interest you guys, and I can see if I can make content around that can interest both of us together.